All right, tribe. Well, we're coming up on about 1,000 miles on this Kawasaki Z900RS Cafe. Z1 for short. Believe me, guys, I have fallen in love with this bike over and over again. And I can promise you that if weather and opportunity would allow for it, it'd have at least double that mileage. But it hasn't come without its set of challenges. So for this video, I wanted to talk about basically what I've done with this motorcycle in terms of modifications, and also share with you some of those cheers and the jeers that I have with this bike. And basically to walk it through, is this the right bike for you? So let's get started on that. All right, guys, so definitely some tasteful mods, I would say. MRA tinted windscreen, that is the stock height. I would definitely recommend that for the aesthetic, but if you want some better wind protection, you're going to have to go a little bit taller. Not for me, but it might be better for you. We've got the anodized heel guards, old school badging, the Brock's exhaust with the Ivan's tune. And speaking of mirrors and, well, now no buffeting, small blind spot checker style mirrors. Absolutely love those. One of the best mods that I've done to the bike early on was to put those mirrors on this bike. Makes a world of difference in buffeting, and actually I feel like they're safer than the stock mirrors. All right, let's talk about everything about this bike that I both like and, well, would like to see some improvement with. Well, before I get into that, yes, I do have a radiator guard coming, and I am going to put the side style grips, not the full loop, but I will be putting those side style grips on the bike, those little grab handles, mainly because it just makes it easier putting it on and taking it off a paddock stand. First things first, what draws you to the bike is the styling. What a good looking bike. And I'll tell you something, guys, again, I purchased this bike without ever having ridden it. I did look up the specifications, figured out that, yeah, the power and the torque and the weight and all of that was going to work out well. It fit well from an ergonomic standpoint. What's not to love? I bought the bike, but along the way, I knew that there were going to have to be some modifications made, and it was pretty readily apparent coming into the riding experience of the bike as it was going through break-in that there were going to have to be some things done. So again, adjusting the bars down made a big difference for me because I come from a sport bike background. I needed a little bit more of a forward approach or a forward posture with this bike, and moving those bars down took care of that for me. Didn't have to mess with risers or anything like that. But what I will say is this, when I started riding the bike, it was apparent straight away that the suspension was way off from the factory. This is something you will hear a lot, and it's a true thing, especially if you're wanting to ride this thing in any kind of spirited way. It's weird. It's almost like somebody putting the suspension together got their math backwards. The rear is far too soft and the front is significantly too stiff. So the settings that I'm working now with this bike, and I feel like I've kind of cracked the code, if you will, for this bike for my kind of riding style. I've softened up the forks. Basically, they're at 2 1/4 turns out from seated. That's pretty well loose. If you look at the owner's manual, with 3 being the stock setting, I've actually loosened it by a full 1/2 or 3/4 of a turn through the process of working through how to get this front end more stable, along with, well, ramping up the preload in the back to 190 millimeters. That was something that had to be done just to basically keep the bike to where it wasn't twitchy, really, when you started to get a little bit more aggressive with it. Dampening in the back, by the way, is 1 full turn out. Compression dampening is 7 turns out, and compression is 6 turns out. That seems to work really well, and it's been very stable at high speeds, say speeds above 125 to 135 miles an hour, and it sits down just fine going through long sweepers, transitions well. It does a lot of fun sport bikey type things, but it's still a standard, and it still has a standard more or less style riding position. Kind of splits that difference between true sport bike and standard, which I really like. And that brings me to something else. The ergonomics of this bike are really good. And it's one of the weird things about motorcycles is that it's more about how the bike fits than it is about how the bike rides or performs from a specification point of view. You can always adjust the ride and you can always adjust suspension, and performance is what it is. You'll know what that is with any bike when you're getting into it. And for this bike, I feel that the performance stock is adequate. So we talked about the suspension and all of that, but the performance of the bike is good from the factory. It's not exceptional. It's not going to blow your mind. And the good thing about the good performance that it has is that it does have a lot of upshot, which means that with a tune and an exhaust, and in this case it's a Brock's exhaust with an Ivan's tune, the bike is now putting down somewhere around 15 to 17% more power to the rear tire. And to be fair, it kind of needed it. If you're going to start comparing this motorcycle to other bikes that are out there, the XSR 900 is one of the first that comes to mind. And yeah, it outpowers the Z1 from the factory in stock form, but the Z1 with a little bit of tweaking and tickling will absolutely outpower the XSR. Even an XSR with some work done to it is going to have a hard time dealing with the Z1 once you kind of started turning some screws. But that's something that I really do want to focus on. If you're buying this bike and expecting 948 cc's to propel you to obnoxious speeds, you're really barking up the wrong tree. It is still a standard at heart, even though it does have a bikini fairing. And although it is plenty powerful and plenty entertaining, it's not going to be a bike that is going to propel you to speeds much more than about 135 miles per hour, at least not comfortably. You got to remember that it's not a full fairing bike. And so if you're coming from a sport bike point of view, like the elder squids that we are, right? Just remember that you've got an entire brick up front that is catching all of the air. So aerodynamic drag really starts to affect this bike maybe a little bit earlier than what you may have expected if you're coming into this bike from a more of a sport bike point of view. But that's not a bad thing. It kind of is a bit of it's kind of a fusible link, a buffer, if you will, to keep you from, becoming overly stupid with the way that you're riding the bike. Because believe me, once you've done a little bit of work and tweaked it just properly, it is a proper hooning machine, and I love the bike for that. Now with the tune, it easily will get to that 130-ish miles per hour should you choose to do so. But it's extremely just expressive on the highway. You roll into the throttle, it reacts immediately and it rips. And that's something that's really fun about this bike. Now, if I were to have some criticisms of it, well, we talked about the suspension just being completely off from the factory. Kawasaki, my guys, you got to get better at that. If it looks like that, and you know how well you can actually get down with this bike in terms of just really spirited, twisty type of, not really a time attack, but just getting out there and having fun, the suspension really does need to reflect that. But the second thing I would have to say is the kind of power that it makes. I can't really complain about just the overall power delivery. And this is not really a fault of the bike, but I would kind of have liked for it to make a little bit more. And don't we always say that? Like, well, if some is good, then more has got to be better, right? If the bike were, instead of 948 cc, say 1,000 or 1048, and you had a little bit more torque production through the mid-range, but a little bit better power hit on the big end, And instead of making peak power around 8,500, if that could have been around 9,500, well, you can still kind of do that with a tune and exhaust. So, well, if it could just make the kind of power from the factory that it makes now, that would have been great. But I think you get the idea, guys. You can always want for more. You can always think that more power is going to do you more better. But I can tell you, so far since I've owned this bike, I have not ever really wanted for more power, knowing that if I had more, then there would be no real relative difference. In other words, what's the difference of a bike getting to 130 miles an hour, say, quickly versus 140? It loses a little bit of the fun factor. Plus, the way that this bike comes from the factory is a little bit aggressively geared, which makes it a lot of fun, and it lets you use the power that the bike has in a very spirited way. This is going to turn, that's going to be kind of a theme for this bike. It's just got a lot of personality. It always wants to play. If the bike had more power, you'd have to numb it with gearing, and if you numbed it with gearing, then would you ever really notice the power there anyway? I think I've kind of talked myself out of a jeer that really wasn't a jeer to begin with. So I guess my final analysis of this thing is, of all the motorcycles that I've been riding lately, and of all the motorcycles that I have owned, I have to admit that if you were to press me for a favorite, it would probably be this one. In fact, not probably, it would be this bike. It's got all the power, all the style, and again, I'll just let you soak in all of this, right? I mean, it looks like that. It rides and performs like a proper middleweight should now. What's not to love about it? So, from a favorites point of view, it's at the top of the list for me. From a just pure aesthetic, it's right there, perfect for what I was looking for, and Kawasaki knocked it out of the ballpark with just the sheer look and feel and the ergonomics of this bike. Just a few tweaks, just a few adjustments, and the bike has turned into the absolute #1 thing that I want to grab the keys to and ride whenever I possibly can. Now, granted, I have spent about the last 500 miles of this bike trying to get the suspension tweaked. And again, I think with the settings that I gave earlier, that's gonna be right about where you would probably be if you're coming from a sport bike mentality. You're wanting to have a little bit of fun with the bike, but you know what you're getting into, and you're just trying to make a standard perform a little bit better. I think that's going to put you right where you need to be. But to call something my favorite and to say that this is the bike that I would absolutely grab the keys first for is the highest compliment that I can give. So with that, guys, post up your comments. Let me know what you think. We'll catch y'all on the next one. That's a wrap.